Great. Welcome everybody to session 5 of Preparing for the Future of Legal Education, Online Teaching Tips and Techniques. This is going to be a great session. It's titled, or the topic is Creating a Framework for Online Learning. We've got two fantastic speakers for you. Corinne Clair is going to be up first. She's the Director of Law School Technology Services at Loyola Marymonth University, Loyola Law School. And she's an instructional designer with a background in distance learning. How appropriate. More than 10 years experience in higher ed. She has a Master of Science in Legal Studies degree with a concentration in cybersecurity and data privacy. And she's a member of the Cali Board of Directors. We've also got Larry Cunningham, who is a Dean Designate of Charleston School of Law, starting, looks like, next week. So I'm glad we could grab some time from you, Larry. He spent 12 years at St. John's University Law School, where he was the Associate Dean for Assessment and Institutional Effectiveness. He blogs at lawschoolassessment.org. And he was recently completed a fully online graduate certificate in assessment and institutional research. So let's get started. Corinne, after you finish taking a sip, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. If you're not sick of it by now, I'm going to say the thing everyone says on Zoom: give me a second while I share my screen. All right, here we go. So as John said, I'm Corinne St. Clair. It is an honor and a privilege to be able to be with you here today. And what I'd hoped to cover after learning about your, the course and the outcomes that you have, what I wanted to focus on was the social, the social presence, of the community of inquiry, and really try to help us create a framework that works for us. And let me explain that. There are lots of educational theories out there which are awesome. And, there's just a lot of overwhelming information. And so today, what I would like to do is to help us look inward a little bit, try to help us understand ourselves, which will also help us understand our students, and then hopefully leave you with some practical examples of things that you can do in your own classrooms, whether it's online or whether it's in person. So before I get a little deeper into that, I titled my presentation "When You Stare into the Abyss," which comes obviously from a Nietzsche quote. I've been feeling this very hard with the COVID pandemic that's going on right now. And if you know the full quote, right? It's when you stare into the abyss stares back into you. And I feel that a lot of what has been going on has been a time to self-reflect, to look at how we teach, to look at the courses, that we have developed. And sometimes when I am staring hard into my computer screen, being like, do this, do this, do this, do this, I forget to stop and ask why. Why are we doing what it is that we are doing? And I think that is a very important question to ask, because it really, really will influence the effectiveness of our teaching. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and where my background and my passion comes from for distance education. As John mentioned, yes, I do have my master's degree in education and human development. My specialty was distance education. And I want to emphasize that because education can be in a variety of modalities, right? Online is just one of them. You could still be doing book or correspondence course type education. So let me share a little bit about myself. I was actually born in Southeast Asia to a photojournalist father and a social worker mother. I was raised in the Philippines, one of the photos that you see there. I went to school in Thailand when we were stationed there. And by the time I was in my teens, we were in Eastern Europe during the fall of the Soviet Union. And so I was going to high school, a private high school in Hungary, while simultaneously attending public school in Moldova and Romania, so that I could get the cross-cultural experience, keep up with my studies, etc. So I've lived in 13 different countries. I just wanted to highlight a few here because they were a very integral part of my education. So for me, creating community and keeping in touch with my friends and with my family was always done from a distance. Being in person was one of the lucky times, that we had. So the idea of being able to create relationship and to create feelings of togetherness, through writing or through phone calls or through, well, once Skype finally, showed up, through doing Skype calls, it wasn't a foreign concept to me. But I do see that a lot of folks are struggling with that idea, as we've moved online, creating that sense of belonging and of unity and of oneness. And so while I was overseas with my parents, and studying in all of these different modalities, they decided that should I ever decide to return to the United States, I should probably get an American education that wouldn't necessarily have to be transferred, over from the school systems that I was in. So they enrolled me in an online program. Online is very, very rudimentary at that time. It was a school here in California. So fun fact, if you look at the little arrow there, that building is in Chisinau, Moldova. It's the capital of the former Soviet Republic of Moldova. That was the building I lived in. We had dial-up, and this is the computer, a similar model of computer that I was using at the time to log in, grab my lessons, log off. You got to save money, right, when you're doing dial-up. And I would basically do my American curriculum this way. Eventually, when we did come back to the United States, I got to graduate from high school in Las Vegas, Nevada. I had never been there before. That's just where the school decided to congregate all of us. But again, long story short, I had a lot of opportunities to meet so many different people, to engage in different modalities of learning. And I do believe it is possible to create effective online engagement that creates great learning and will have lifelong impact. So let me stop and talk really quickly about the coronavirus, COVID-19. This has been a tumultuous time, right? It's a pandemic. I want to challenge you today. Have you taken the time to stop, to just stop and given yourself permission to process everything that has been going on? When the pandemic first started, it was a rush, wasn't it? All of us were moving to remote emergency online teaching and learning. Everyone was doing the best that they could. Everyone was not sleeping, pretty much, right? Everyone was scrambling to convert from what do we do in person? Can we do it online? For those who already had online programs, as well, how can we scale it? There was a lot happening, but I don't think many of us have had the opportunity to just stop, take a breath, and process. Because what has happened all across the world is traumatic. And when trauma happens, we have elevated levels of adrenaline. We have that flight or fight response. And when we're presented with new ideas or are honestly forced to adapt, one of the biggest feelings that we can have is fear. And when we let fear get in the way, it can blind us to doing things, well, more effectively, but also it can blind us from taking care of ourselves. And one thing that I would like to challenge everyone with today is the idea of refilling your cup. Because when you are not full, and I know this is a hot air balloon and I said refilling your cup, haha, dissonance, just kidding. But what I want you to think about is, what are you doing to fire yourself, to refill yourself? Because when we are empty, we cannot give back. And we are being asked to give a lot, aren't we? Not just with the school, not just with our students who we desperately, right, want to have a good experience, but with our families, with our communities. We're being asked to be present. But please, I want to encourage you to take care of yourself. Take absolute care of yourself, and it will help you take care of those around you. So I want to challenge us with a few things to think about today. Another Nietzsche quote. Sorry, I think I got a little existential when I was preparing this presentation. I love this quote. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. And to be quite cheeky for a second, even online learning. But we have to have that why. And I guess that's where frameworks come in, right? They try to help us explain how the world works. But I want us to focus, again, I keep repeating this, focus on that why. Focus on that why. It wouldn't be a proper presentation if I didn't bring up Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, especially after throwing around things like, well, it was a traumatic experience. There's so much going on. Human need, take care of yourself. This is the classic example of how we understand humans to work, right? We have the bottom part of the pyramid and we're supposed to be working our way to the top. And as you know, if we don't have the bottom needs met, at least this is how the classic thinking goes, right? Then it's going to be harder to achieve the topmost points. If you aren't having your physiological needs met, if you don't feel safe, which a lot of us probably didn't during the beginning stages of the COVID crisis, right? It's hard to focus on, well, I wonder if I should publish that paper. You know, the self-actualization, the esteem, you're in flight or fight mode, right? So this is the classic example, and it's presented as a linear, right? It's presented as a linear voyage. You know, get this part handled, then you'll be able to do the top part. Well, there's a new model that has been suggested, and it is an analogy actually for the Maslow's needs. It's the sailboat analogy, and I love it so much. It was presented by Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman. Highly recommend this book, by the way. He presented it as a sailboat because life is not linear most of the time. It's not always a pyramid that you can climb. Instead, what he suggests is our needs are more like a sailboat, with the hull being our physiological, you know, our safety needs, all of the things that we need to feel a solid foundation. But then the sail is what is the higher needs, or what could be considered the higher needs. And he encapsulates all of this under something that we all know, right? The purpose. And I love this analogy because if you've ever been sailing, or if you've even just seen a sailboat, right? When they're in the harbor, their sails are closed. They don't need the wind to go anywhere. It's a time to stay still. But then you open the sails and you fill it. You know, what do we fill our sails with? You know, whether it is the self-actualization, whether it is esteem, happiness, which can be fleeting, right? Love, belonging, you know, all these different things. Or maybe sometimes on rough seas, it's time to close. It's time to close them. It's a fuller analogy for adapting and being adaptable. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, I thought I came to a presentation on the community of inquiry and how to create social presence. Bear with me. The reason that I am presenting this first is because I would like to challenge all of us to remember what it's like to be human. You have needs. Your students have needs. And as we go and we create activities, as we choose different tools to use, as we create rubrics to assess, remember that you're human. Remember that they are human. Remember that we're in kind of a crazy time that is ever evolving. And there are all these things inside of us that are at play. And as educators, what we want to create for our students, right, is a safe space to learn, to experiment, to take risks, to learn from that, to grow, and eventually become the effective, amazing lawyers that we want them to be, that we know they will be, right? Don't forget the human element. There are lots of frameworks for educational theory. There are lots of ways that you can apply it, but don't forget the human being who's going to be going through it, developing it, that's you, and those living through it, you and your students together. It affects the community that you create. When I was an undergrad, I had a professor who will probably be mortified if she ever sees this video to see that I am quoting her right now. But one thing that she told me, it was an English literature class, so a little bit of context there. In all of our assignments, she always told us this: ask why until you can ask why no more. Ask why until you can ask why no more. And if you look at the different frameworks that are presented for educational theories, learning, all that fun stuff, it's actually trying to build more structure around that why. What is the purpose? What is the goal? What is the final result, that students should be able to do? But as you look at that, ask again, why? And when you have that, ask again, why? And when you have that, ask again, why? Until you can ask why no more. When you feel overwhelmed by all the check boxes and all the different tools that you could possibly use, as you analyze why you should bring it into your classroom, ask again, why? And after that, ask again, why? And see if you're satisfied with your answers, because you then will be able to believe in what you are doing. So let's talk about creating these spaces to learn. Sure, let's talk about frameworks and rubrics. I'm going to speak to you now from my own experience. Everything that I am about to share are things that I've learned, my own personal opinion, things I get excited about, do not reflect the views of my employer or any spiritual entity or anything else. Horrible legal disclaimer there, but this is all me at this point, sharing my ideas and my excitement with you, based of course on what I've learned from others, and I'm absolutely going to throw their names out there when it comes up. But let's talk about some frameworks and let's talk about rubrics. So learning design, instructional design. I'm an instructional designer. We're trained to look at problems and ask, well, what is the ultimate outcome that we're trying to get to? I feel like lawyers and instructional designers are the perfect blend, because both of our professions usually answer questions with, it depends. What tool should I use? It depends. How should I build this rubric? It depends. Should I go to court? Should we go to trial? It depends, right? So here's the shortest lesson on instructional design ever, trying to consolidate a bunch of learning into 4 different points. As you look at the different items that you're building, discussion boards, quizzes, print materials, video lectures, ask yourselves these things. What does the learner need to learn in the lesson? So that's your learning outcome, right? What is the end goal? How will they learn the lesson? Whether that be video, right? Whether it be a rubric, which we'll get to that in a second. Whether it be, well, looking across the internet themselves for information. Westlaw, LexisNexis, Bloomberg, whatever you happen to assign them. But here, my opinion right now, these next 2 are things I believe we struggle with in legal education. How will the learner assess for themselves if they've successfully learned the lesson? How will they assess for themselves that they've successfully learned the lesson? Sitting in my own law school courses, getting the Master of Science in Legal Studies, I was surprised. I was surprised that all of my grade was going to depend on a final exam at the end of the semester that was going to take approximately 3 to 4 hours. And it was a culmination of everything that we had done in the classroom. But of course, sure, that's what we had to do, right? In the classroom, the cold calling, it is effective. It can spur dialogue. It can, get you to try to think deeper about the things that you read. At the same time, my classmates and I would struggle to do the readings, try to get it all in. When you were called on, it's like, well, I hope I answered enough to pass. But do we know enough? It always left with, it depends. So it was hard as a student to figure out, are you doing well? In fact, the advice that we were given during orientation was, the first 5 weeks of law school may seem very confusing, but something will click and it will make a lot of sense. You will start to think like a lawyer. It was true. Those first 4 to 5 weeks were so confusing. It felt that everything we did was a failure. And then all of a sudden, IRAC started making sense. Being cold called wasn't as terrifying. We were finally figuring out how to assess for ourselves that we were learning the materials that we were supposed to learn and what was expected of us. But I'll be honest, it was hard. And a lot of the times, students are left to themselves. We can change that, I think. And finally, number 4, how will the learner show their mastery to others? Whether that be through an exam, not my favorite a lot of the time, but absolutely, we could do it through a final exam, multiple choice, essay questions. Maybe it's smaller formative assessments that build on each other so that it feels like a progression to a final culmination. But the key here is they need to understand for themselves and they need to be able to show it to others. So that's instructional design in a nutshell, the shortest, hopefully the shortest lesson ever. The key to building online courses and the key to building effective rubrics is to clearly communicate your expectations. When we are in person, there's a lot more that we can read, right? We can read body language. We can read facial expressions. We can tell if people are paying attention or not, if they're sitting in the class, right? Like looking on their phones. It's like, yeah, okay, answer the question. Okay, back to whatever it was I was doing. In an online environment where you may have synchronous or asynchronous components, you don't get all of that feedback. In fact, being on Zoom, right? You don't get all of that feedback. Right now, it feels like I'm just talking into a camera because I don't get to see all of you. But what are the expectations? Knowing and communicating clearly helps bring that sense of safety and really does help create the community that you are trying to create in an online environment. Because I will know as a student, right? If the professor tells me, hey, this assignment, purely self-assessment, here's what I hope you look for. Actually, don't use the word hope. Say, here's what I want you to look for. Here's how I would like you to respond. This is why I want you to do this. Excellent. You've set me down a right path. Communicate, 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 and always give that why. So whatever you're doing in your class, again, set the expectations, communicate them clearly. So let's talk about rubrics for a hot minute, a very hot minute, because I really want to get to my fellow presenter who is going to dive deeper into this. So I just want to lay a quick groundwork. For rubrics, you've seen this before. This is the format, right? The top horizontal area is how well do you understand whatever it was. It can be a scale. It can be, as you see the sample here, we have 4 columns. We've got words to describe it. Some folks use numbers. Some folks flip it, actually. It might be from the lowest to the highest. And then across the vertical axis, we have whatever it is that's being assessed. I believe the biggest challenge when creating a rubric is deciding what goes on the vertical axis, because you have to ask yourself the question, why? Why do I want them to format this properly? What does properly mean? What am I expecting from that? Why am I expecting that? What you may expect from a torts class may be very different from what you expect from a trial ad class. So creating those criteria and taking the time to really, really think through what you as the professor want to see in your students. It's the why. It also gives the students the why on why they should rise to that challenge. So don't despair. There's a lot of different samples out there, which is why I didn't decide to include it in my presentation today. A quick Google search will bombard you with multiple rubrics that you could look at. But what I wanted to challenge you today is just for yourself. If there was no learning theory and all you had was this chart, what would you put there for your students in your class, the way that you teach, and why? It'll actually save you time grading to do this type of work ahead of time too. So take that moment and say why. Okay, one example. I used to teach public speaking, both in person and online. I know, it was a crazy time, and I was much younger then than I am now. Here's a sample. Actually, it's a really bastardized version of one of the rubrics that I used to use for the students' speeches. One of the things that can be very intimidating about a rubric is this middle portion. Because once you've come up with the vertical axis of what it is that you are evaluating, it can take so much time to decide what the different nuances are between the different performance factors. What makes something, well, in this example, accomplished versus exemplary. And of course, as educators and working in institutions of higher learning in academia, we can't say things like, excellent work, couldn't have done it better, all the way down to, okay, that sucks, right? Also not very helpful. Now we don't know as a student how we could improve. It seems very subjective, and it is. But if you can give the why, if you can articulate more fully what it is you're looking for and what gives it that extra oomph to get them right into that next column, we never fully arrive. But for that moment, what is it that you're looking for that differentiates an okay performance from a, that was mind-blowing, but here's also still how you can improve type of thing? That takes time, and only you can do it. Only you can do it. Even with the different types of frameworks that can be provided, only you can decide what it is you are looking for in your students from your lectures, and how you're going to assess them and their knowledge and how they're receiving it afterwards. Keep asking why. Keep asking why. And if you don't have a satisfactory answer for why you're asking to assess them on this, or why you're doing something in a particular way, maybe it's time to say, this does not bring me joy, and let it go and try something else instead. Or if you're like, you know, this has worked for 20 years and this is why I want to do it. All right, then let's see how we can translate that into a different context. And that will take work, but it will be worth it because you know your why. I want to wrap up with a couple practical things. I know that folks are, you know, being given lots of multiple examples of ways to, well, build online courses. But from my experience, I want to leave you with 5 different activities that they call them the active learning activities that you can try in different modalities. This may be discussion boards. This may be through video. It could be through a Zoom chat. But let me give you 5 practical ways to get yourself thinking, to get your students thinking, and to get those conversations and that social and cognitive meld together when you're in an online course. If you've never heard of this book before, I highly recommend it. This was near and dear to my heart and close to a Bible when I first started teaching, and there was a previous versions. This is the current one, so this is the one that I wanted to share with you all. Elizabeth Barkley is an amazing, amazing educator. Music, actually, is her background. And so these ideas and these examples were things that I learned through her teaching, and I've adapted to the different types of things that I do today. So the first thing that the first activity that I'd like to share with you, I like to call the before and after. Some folks like to call it the pre-write, the post-write. Some folks like to call it, well, really it's before and after. I think of it like those photos, right? You know, the before shower, after shower. But what this is it asks the students to write 1 to 2 sentences, maybe a paragraph if you want to get a little more lengthy, or maybe even share in a class about what they already know about a topic. So when I used to teach public speaking, I would ask my students, what do you know about demonstrative speeches? Like, most of them would say, I have nothing, just nothing, don't know anything. Others are like, got this, did the reading, I can do this, blah, blah, blah. All right. So they'd write it down on a piece on their notes during class. This was my in-person class. And they write down the notes in the class. Okay, cool. After the lecture, after class, after all our activities, revisit, write what you learned, compare. Did anything change? It could be as in-depth or as quick as possible, but it provided that mental check-in of, okay, maybe I didn't understand as much as I thought I did, and maybe I can do something different to improve. It also gave me a way when I did it online, I did through discussion boards, to see, all right, they're getting it, or maybe they're not. Another activity that I love, concept connections. And this is a little scary. So with concept connections, I call it concept connections. I think there's another term for it. But ask your students to describe how part of your lecture or part of your module or part of whatever, insert XYZ, connects to the learning objectives of your course. And then have them discuss it. I will tell you that is a mirror that you cannot run away from. And it's a great feedback to receive as the course goes on, because I think I've created activities that match up with my learning outcomes. One, because I'm lazy and I want to be able to show very clearly, like, this is what we did and this is how you got to there. But it's also a good gauge for the students to remember, like, oh, that's why we're doing this. And they have to articulate why it is, right, that we're doing it. So again, have them describe, like, why did we do this discussion? How does it relate to learning outcome number 1? Or if they can't find a learning outcome, maybe it's time to reassess, and let them discuss and let them know it's a safe space. Feedback is appreciated. Confidence checking. This one was a hard one for me as a student, because I love to be perfect. I love to know the answer and I want to be right. I want to raise my hand and answer it right. But when I do quizzes, one thing that I would suggest, if possible, to build it in, have them answer an objective question and then rate their confidence on that. So for example, might be, what is the color of the sky? Super simple, I know. Blue. What is your confidence? Extremely high. All right. What's the capital of Nigeria? Pick and choose. What was your confidence? Really low. It can help you chart and see, okay, they either do get it and they feel that they get it, or there might be a disconnect of they actually aren't getting it, but they feel super confident that they are. So it's another check-in of that, tying that teaching and cognition together that you can do in your classroom. Let me finish up with 2 more. So we can get to the other portion. One of my favorites, the stop, drop, and share. So the stop, drop, and share. This is great in an in-person classroom, can also be great when you're in a Zoom session. Just stop. Check in with everyone. You don't have to hear back from everyone, but you can check in. Ask them, what are you doing? Let me do that with you right now. What are you doing? Have you zoned out? Have you started checking on your cell phone? Did your cat jump into your lap and, maybe you need a glass of water? Just stop, take that break, and then we'll get back into it. I highly recommend this, especially in long Zoom sessions. It can be really nice to get that quick cognitive break, let you reset, and then come back and focus more fully on the lesson at hand. The final one's pretty classic, the 3-2-1. They call it the 3-2-1 in the book actually as well. What are 3 things you've learned? What are 2 particularly interesting points? And finally end with 1 question. Some folks change that up with the summarize the lecture in 1 sentence, which I believe would be pretty challenging, especially for law school lectures. But hey, maybe give it a shot and then change it up later down the road. But it helps give you something as you go into a learning experience to see, all right, were there 3 new things that I learned? Were there 2 particularly interesting things? Like maybe that contract that I said I signed on a bar napkin is enforceable? Oh boy, makes it a little more exciting, but also gives you a way to process a lot of information that you're going through. So those are 5 very quick suggestions, hopefully practical suggestions that you could try to implement, whether it's discussion boards, quizzes, your online Zoom classes. Let me end with this. Again, know your why. Know your why. Give yourself permission to stop, to process, to consider your why you teach, why you're going to do something in your class, why you're going to choose a specific technology, and share that with your community. Why should the students care? Why, until you can ask why no more. I'd like to end with this final quote. If in your interactions with others, but especially with yourself, you're going through a lot, especially with yourself, you are presented with the choice to be right or to be kind. I hope you find it in your heart to be kind. You are amazing. You are going to continue changing the world. It will be overwhelming, but you've got this. Dive in, know your why. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. I feel wonderful. Larry, why don't you take it right up, and Corinne, I'll ask you to take a look at some of the questions to be prepared to answer when Larry finishes up.
Okay, fantastic. John, can you hear me okay? And is my screen coming through?
Yes and yes.
Wonderful, thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Larry Cunningham. I'm sort of in this middle ground right now where I'm still technically on the faculty of St. John's Law School, but I am starting next week as Dean of Charleston Law School here in South Carolina. And so I wanted to talk about community of inquiry from a particular perspective, which is that of a student. And I want to share some of my experiences having been an online student recently, and how that can help us as teachers to sort of frame the teaching presence of the community of inquiry model. How do we select the content for our courses? How do we set the climate for our courses? So a little bit of background. I went through a 15 credit graduate certificate program through Sam Houston State University in their Department of Higher Education Leadership. It was a fully online program. I have never once set foot on the campus of Sam Houston. Overall, I had a fantastic experience, and it actually made me a better professor. So I not only learned a whole lot about the particular subject matter, but I found that it also influenced my law teaching. And what I want to share with you are some of the lessons I learned that I think I, as a professor, can take away from having been a student. So a little bit about the program I was in. It was a 15 credit certificate program in assessment and institutional research, fully online, mostly asynchronous, spread out over the course of about a year. I took 5 courses. The first was a sort of a general survey course about higher education literature, as well as a fundamentals in data management course, which is really focused on institutional research, courses in assessment in higher education, as well as statistics for IR, and then finally a course in leadership in higher education. And overall, I had, as I said, a phenomenal experience. But there were some things that were better than others in the program. And what I tried to do was come up with a list, sort of a checklist of do's and don'ts for sustained engagement from a student's perspective. How do you build a community so that you're not just conveying information, but that you're actually creating a community of learning in the same way that there is a community of learning in our face-to-face courses, whether that's students helping each other if they have questions, they're talking to each other before or after class, during break, where there might be study groups that are outlining together. How do we replicate those types of experiences in an online model? And I've sort of labeled each of these items or lessons learned with an emoji. Things that worked really, really well, that I really liked and appreciated as a student, all the way to things that I wish had been done a little differently. So the very first thing is that I appreciated in each of my 5 classes was a crystal clear syllabus and set of instructions. The syllabus was well thought out, It laid out exactly what I needed to do week by week in each of the courses. It set forth each of the expectations for the course. And so it was something that I could have in front of me really every week and be able to follow. And I knew exactly what I needed to do in terms of the class. Probably the best thing that each of my professors did in each of these 5 classes was to have us introduce ourselves. It was typically done through a discussion board post, or in some cases, recording a video, a screencast type video. These were phenomenal because it helped me learn who the other students were in the course, what their backgrounds were, what perspectives they were bringing to the particular course. And so I think that's something that's very easy to do. And I've now done that in all of my regular face-to-face classes. I now have an initial assignment that the students do, which is a short introduction of themselves. Number 3, another way to create engagement and community building is by having students create video lessons on discrete topics. So I'll give you an example of this. In my statistics class, the professor had us each record a 12 to 15-minute video on a different statistical test. I think mine was on the two-way analysis of variance. So I had to create a PowerPoint and then lecture over it for 12 to 15 minutes. Following up on Corinne's presentation, there was a rubric that clearly laid out what the professor was expecting from me on that video. And what I really appreciated was the professor had me send a draft of the presentation to her. We then had a 10 minutes Zoom call where she offered some feedback, and then I recorded the final product. So that was a way of engaging with the professor, and then my final product was a way of engaging with the entire class. Number 4, group projects. Group projects that were around meaningful questions, meaning it wasn't busy work that the professor had us do, but it was sort of higher level, questions or problems to work through. And the program provided us with free Zoom accounts. And I know a lot of schools now are providing either Zoom or WebEx or Microsoft Teams accounts, not only to professors, but also to students. And that was a lot of fun. That was a great way to interact with other students. It sort of replicated in a way the study group model that we have in law schools. So for example, in my appellate advocacy course, I have students work in teams. I give them an appellate problem that has 2 issues, and they have to work through them as a team. And that's a way to engage, obviously, with another person in the class. So the idea here is that we're not, this is not just a one-on-one experience or an experience where a student is going to passively sit back and watch some videos and be done with the experience. It's instead a way of engaging with other students and with the professor. So most of my courses were asynchronous. There were weekly modules that myself and other students had to complete, but there were synchronous sessions that were sort of sprinkled throughout the semester. And these were really beneficial because they were very smartly designed. They were designed to complement the asynchronous work. So the professor didn't just get up and sort of rehash the points that were made in the videos, either the professor videos or the student videos or the readings. It was really designed for the synchronous sessions to really build on the asynchronous work. So it was discussing a particular topic that the professor knew would be problematic. In our data management class, for instance, the professor would go over examples of how to use very sophisticated tools in Excel to run some analyses, things that you really couldn't do in another type of format. So why were the synchronous sessions so great? Because they, first of all, assumed basic knowledge. It was not just sort of going over the same material as in the reading. The professor nearly always began with some sort of icebreaker. So it wasn't just a large-scale webinar, sort of like what this is with 300 plus participants, but it was instead about 20 of us, and the professor would have us go around and either say what we're working on in terms of our research or some other kind of icebreaker activity, so that the expectation was there that the rest of the session would be interactive. So this was not a sort of a talking head professor sort of communicating something that could have been done in an asynchronous video. This was instead something where the topic naturally lent itself to being something that was interactive. And so the synchronous sessions, it was not every week, it was every couple of weeks, but I found they were really, really beneficial. Okay, let's talk about discussion boards and discussion posts. This was, I think, the part of my experience as a student I liked the least, because I found that a lot of the time they were busy work. And when I've talked to other professionals who have gone through online programs, so for example, my husband went through a labor, he's in human resources, he went through a master's program in HR through Penn State. And he said, prepare yourself. There's going to be times where there's busy work, where you just thought you were just sort of going through the motions. And at times I found that discussion posts on boards were kind of like that. It was just sort of regurgitating material from the reading. On the other hand, there were other times where the discussion posts were really meaningful. I actually learned something from them. And the difference was that there were sort of these four characteristics to them. First of all, the professor provided a rubric. So I knew exactly what was expected of me, and being a type A personality, I really wanted to get the highest score. And so I knew exactly what I needed to do in each of those categories. The professor also communicated ahead of time high expectation for discussion posts. They would say something early on like, it's not going to be enough to just say me too in response to somebody else's post, or have a one sentence response to a question. There were really high expectations. The professor also set interim deadlines, which I'll talk about in a moment. And this was key. The professor participated in the discussion forums. So we as students knew that the professor was going to be there and was going to sort of be prodding the conversation along and sort of having a watchful eye over what we were talking about. And I think what's key is to sort of have Bloom's taxonomy sort of in the back of your mind. So Bloom's taxonomy is a very old, from I think the 1950s, a way of thinking about student learning, where you have sort of very basic kind of learning at the bottom of the pyramid, and then very higher level thinking at the top. And what we as educators typically want to do is we want to move students from the bottom of the framework more towards the top. So I teach evidence, for instance. I don't want students just to remember the rule numbers, so know what rule 403 is or rule 401 is. I want students to be able to analyze problems, evaluate them for an evidentiary analysis, and then create a well-written essay that responds to a hypothetical. In order to get there, students have to be able to remember the rule, understand the rule, and be able to apply the rule. And so I think in terms of designing discussion board questions, the ones that I found to be most valuable were ones at sort of the top of the pyramid. So if the professor's discussion board question just merely asked me to regurgitate something from the textbook, that was busy work. But if it was to really think through and evaluate something. Maybe it was a reading, or maybe it was a problem or a hypothetical. That I found much more valuable because it got me thinking before I actually did the work. So how do we have meaningful discussion boards to again create that sense of community? First of all, consider at the beginning whether a discussion board is even the best way to have students participate in this learning activity. Think about, is a quiz better? Is a wiki better? Is a blog better? Is a synchronous session better for a discussion? You know, I would not use a discussion board, for instance, for something that is a very, very difficult or emotional topic. I would probably save that for a synchronous discussion where you can read body language and you're able to sort of intervene and have a back and forth kind of discussion. So really think about all of the tools at your disposal and ask, is a discussion board the best mechanism? And by the way, if you don't know what a wiki is or a blog is, that's fine. What I encourage you to do, if you haven't done so already, is go through a training at your university for whatever learning management system you have, whether it's Blackboard or Twin or Canvas or Moodle or D2L, whatever it is, so that you know what all the tools are that you can take advantage of. Number two, this is the interim deadline idea that I mentioned before. What a lot of my professors did was they said, you have actually 2 deadlines in a week. Your initial post is due Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. By the way, never make a deadline midnight. We're all lawyers. We know the problem with interpreting what midnight is. Always make it 11:59 or something. So we had to make our initial post Wednesday night, and then we had to reply to somebody else's Sunday night. So that really forced us to spread out the discussion. You know, I couldn't just log on at 11:30 p.m. on Sunday and do 3 discussion board posts and be done with it. I had to have my initial one on Wednesday and then a reply on Sunday. Have very thoughtful prompts that really try to move students up Bloom's taxonomy. So avoid the questions that are, you know, just sort of gotcha type questions, you know, where they just have to hunt through the textbook to find the answer. You really want to have, you know, deep thinking type questions or maybe hypotheticals. Discussion boards, don't overuse them. A lot of my courses, the discussion boards there were maybe only 3 or 4 of them throughout the entire semester. It wasn't every week. If you do it every week, students get fatigued and they really do view it as busy work. And so I would mix it up, maybe do a quiz one week, a discussion board post another. Play an active role. Be in there in the discussion board post. Respond to students. Respond with questions or provide praise for students who are giving very thoughtful responses. Intervene if you see a discussion post sort of veering off into an area where they're going to start to be personal attacks and things like that. Grade them. That provides an external reward. But make sure you're grading not just sort of whether they did it or not, but reward students if a post advances a discussion. In contrast, downgrade students, and by the way, all of this should be in a rubric so students know what's expected of them. Downgrade if they do what's called cluster posting. And you can see from the timestamps, 11:30, student posted one comment, 11:31, another one, 11:32. They're just going through the motions. Downgrade them on that. And be transparent. Have students know what is expected of them in terms of the grading. Keep it informal. It is a discussion after all. One of the things that irked me about one of my classes was the professor required proper citation form. So this was higher education, and so we didn't use the Blue Book, we used the American Psychological Association citation guide. And so every single one of our posts had to have in-text citations, as well as a bibliography, which really cut down on the informal nature of what was supposed to be a conversation. Other suggestions, not so much in terms of community of inquiry, but just sort of some suggestions as a former online student. Have crystal clear learning outcomes and align everything in your material to those outcomes. All of the syllabi that I was provided in my program, I knew exactly what was expected of me, and I was able to tell how every single activity and assessment tied into that learning outcome. This was not a death march through a textbook. This was instead 12 or 13 very thoughtfully designed modules, each of which were designed to achieve a particular learning outcome. Spaced repetition. Corinne mentioned that earlier. And this was really key in my statistics class, because I hadn't taken stats since probably college. We were constantly going back to old material. So it was sort of, we would take 3 steps forward and then 1 step back. And so the professor was constantly reinforcing material from previous units or chapters. And that's something that I'm trying to do more of in my evidence class, so that I don't just cover every set of rules in isolation, but I'm showing how the rules all link together. So for example, how Rule 403 always provides kind of this catch-all to keep out evidence that we may think is unreliable or prejudicial. Instructional videos. So these are the asynchronous videos that professors would create. They were always short. There was never one that was more than 15 minutes. That's the ideal time to absorb content. Now, there might be multiple videos to watch in a particular unit, but as the student, I was able to do, one in the morning, one after work, one on a weekend. I was able to go back to them if I needed a refresher. And the beauty of those videos is that once you create them as the professor, they're always there. So in my evidence class, I have a series of these short 15-minute videos that I created years ago. I had a lot less gray hair back then, but I don't care. I recorded the video, and the content is still good. And they're really fantastic. Students can go back and watch them at their leisure. Have students do, not just read. The best way to learn something, if you go back to Bloom's taxonomy, it's not enough just to assign a reading from a textbook and expect students to get it. We don't do that in our face-to-face classes. We don't do it in effective online classes. I learned the best as a student when I did something, when I created a data analysis project in Excel, when I wrote a paper on a higher ed topic, when I solved a statistics problem. When I was doing, I was learning much more than when I was reading. One-on-one coaching and feedback, if you have the time, can be incredibly valuable. I remember, going into the program, my very first paper, the professor set up a one-on-one Zoom meeting, 10 minutes long, to go over it. He didn't mark it up, line by line. I come from the legal writing community, and very often in legal writing projects, we're writing up and making comments on every line. And actually, some of the best learning can take place if you sort of take a step back and look at the macro level. I distinctly remember this, professor, after my first paper, he said, "Look, Larry, it was very, very well done. I know you're a professor. I'm a professor. We're all professors here. But here's what, I want you to get something out of this program besides the credential." And I remember to this day what he said. He said, "I challenge you to do X, Y, and Z." He used that language. I challenge you to go off in this different direction, or explore this topic, or think about this problem in a particular way. And to this day, it's one of the lessons that I really learned, finding ways, even with top students in a class, to provide feedback and encourage them to go a step further. So that's it. I think I'm out of time anyway. I welcome emails. If you have any questions, obviously we have time now for Q&A, but if you think of something after the fact, please feel free to email. Probably the best way is at my new Charleston address. But I've enjoyed being with you, and I look forward to your questions.
That was great. Thank you, Larry. So I'm gonna try to filter. We have a lot of time for questions, which is awesome. There's a whole bunch of questions that I'm gonna generalize some of them a little bit to scale. How do you handle if you've got a class of 90 students watching 90 introduction videos, or how do you deal with having to respond to 90 students turning in little writing assignments or responding to them on discussion boards? Let's just call it the big class versus the small class problem. Either of you can take this, or both of you.
The honest answer is wine. I'm kidding. But really,
Coffee.
You much smarter. You have to find what works for you. The largest class I have ever had was 65. And watching all of you do like 120 students in a class is amazing. But what I would say is you have to figure out what works for you and how much time you have. And so, for example, while a 1-minute introduction video, adds up to 90 minutes, right? I may challenge them to like keep it down to 10 seconds, but share like the top 3 things that, like try to narrow it down. But again, it depends. So yeah, I guess it really depends on your context and what you have the bandwidth to do, and what you could reasonably commit so that you can give good feedback and forgive yourself on the days that you don't, because it'll happen.
Yeah, my classes at Sam Houston were all about 20 students, which is really what it should be for online learning. And I recognize that a lot of schools are still in sort of this emergency triage mode. But a few ideas that, if you have, let's say, a 90-person evidence class, self-assessment, a well-designed self-assessment can be very effective. A well-designed peer assessment, where you basically make the students do the work. There's actually research in higher education literature that that 3 peer reviews can actually be superior in quality to 1 professor review. And there's various software platforms out there that can help facilitate that. The beauty of a lot of these kinds of tools is that there's a lot written about them. And so if you just Google, designing an effective peer assessment or designing an effective self-assessment, you're going to find a lot of centers for teaching and learning at universities with some very helpful suggestions, rubrics, instructions, recommendations for software products that you can use. But otherwise, I would say that, and this goes back to syllabus design, you really, I think, have to think carefully about what your bandwidth is. And so maybe you're not doing a discussion board post 3 times in the semester. Maybe you're doing it once, or maybe you're doing it twice. Maybe you have students sort of divided up into groups where 20 students at a time will be doing discussion board posts, and the other students in the class will be observing. This is called the fishbowl approach to discussion boards, where you have 20 students kind of working at a time, and then everybody else is watching and is required to read, but doesn't have to respond. And so those were, I think, my main suggestions.
Let me use that to ask a technical question. You mentioned about downgrading people's discussions if they're like just going through at 11:30, 11:31, and so on. Can you be more explicit about what do you mean by grading there? I mean, are you grading individual discussion answers on a course sheet?
Yes, that's right. There would be, in most learning management systems, you can view the discussion board by student. And so you can find, it'll pop up all of John Smith's his original discussion board post, plus let's say if you require 2 replies, and you can see the timestamps and you can see how long, and if his posts, his replies follow a minute after and they're just I agree or I disagree, you could downgrade that. On the other hand, I would be mindful that students might be writing their responses offline and just copying and pasting into the discussion board. So I wouldn't necessarily downgrade just based on the timestamps. I would look to see whether it was a post that meaningfully contributed to the discussion.
Sure.
I would
Go ahead.
like to follow up with that. Just an online generational thing where sometimes students forget that they're not texting, right? They're in a discussion board and they might actually type I agree and are writing their more substantive response, being like, oh, whoops, I hit, enter. So I usually try to take it with a grain of salt, but if it starts to become a habit, then, we need to address it. But there might be like single sentences back and forth, and you have to decide, is that how I want my students to do this? Is that okay? Can I do this? And go from there.
Cool. So I'm trying to absorb the questions. The sense I'm getting from a couple of them is how do you deal with the lost student or the unmotivated student? The ones who copy and paste stuff, when they're doing group work, the ones who sort of, maybe they're doing the minimum viable product to keep you off their tail, so to speak, or they've disappeared entirely. And if you're in an entirely online class, it's easy for students to disappear. How do you motivate them to read the syllabus and to actually use the rubrics as a way to measure themselves? Hard question, I know.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, the nice thing is that most learning management systems will help you in this regard. There will be a dashboard for the professor to be able to track, and it may be called early alert, it may be called dashboard, but for example, it might give you an alert and say, these 5 students have not even logged into the course in the last week. Well, that's probably when I, as the professor, just like if 5 students didn't show up for my class in a week, I'm probably going to send them an individual email, and say, I just want to check in. I noticed you were absent. Is everything okay? For all you know, they dropped the class, or they've been administratively withdrawn, or something significantly has happened. And the sooner you intervene, the easier it is to get them back on track. So I would let the technology here help you in terms of sort of prioritizing and triaging the students who may not be as engaged.
And I've been making the point, and tell me if I'm wrong or not, that if you're in an entirely online class, you have to work a little harder for that motivation and for that engagement. Because you don't have the power of your personality in the room to compensate for the lack of interpersonal interaction. You know what I'm saying?
It's definitely different. It's definitely different for sure. Usually, I want to say if you've never taught an online class from the beginning, like where you don't get to meet your students in person, actually after week 1 or 2, and Larry, I don't know if you feel the same way, but you kind of start to see their personalities, whether it's through their writing, if they reach out to you or if they choose not to, how they structure their emails, if they choose to avail of calling you or office hours. You start to get a picture of different people, and you start to notice, like, I don't see certain names popping up in my inbox, or the learning management system can help track, like, do they log in even, and as you have the different activities in your class, as long as it's not just straight I post videos, you watch them, good luck, right? If there are some activities, you will start to get to know your students, and it's a judgment call. I've had on how to engage them further if you feel that there is concern. I mean, I've had students who were the most interactive and then just suddenly disappeared, from a class. And it turns out, they were having family issues, and I did not feel competent, to help guide them through that. But at least we could talk about, all right, what are we going to do for the class, or, they did end up dropping the class, but yeah, it takes a lot of work. But you will start to see your students' personalities and be able to make calls from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to think about is that in a face-to-face class, I think most professors don't just walk into the class at 10 a.m. and then immediately leave at 12 p.m. What we're trying to do is we're trying to recreate the kinds of interactions that we have with students before class, during a break in the middle of class, at the end of class, in office hours. These are all ways of engagement. And that's why I really am a big proponent in even the biggest class, even in a face-to-face class, I will have students post some sort of introduction of themselves, just so I can learn who's working two jobs, who has a family, who may write in all lowercase without, or with, stream of consciousness without any punctuation at all. There's a way to sort of help you in the beginning start to figure out who the students are and what challenges each of them may present.
Thanks. Any advice for folks who are going into a situation where they have both a hybrid class, where they're going to be teaching into a classroom and to an online cohort, and they may be present in the classroom or they may be remote to both?
It's hard. Oh no, I will straight up, again, disclaimer, these are my personal opinions and not the opinions of my employer and or any other entity. It is hard to manage both simultaneously. We as human beings, especially as, when you're teaching, it is usually a very single focus to a very particular audience, and you prefer that the audience be right in front of you so that you get the feedback. And so if you have a synchronous Zoom session happening at the same time behind you or to the side of you, it is a management issue. And I will be the first to say that I don't think I could handle it alone effectively. And so my advice would be, if you haven't tried it before, try it. How comfortable are you with the tools that you will be engaging with? Being on my laptop here at home right now is very different from being in a classroom on campus. And how comfortable do I feel with that? Once I'm there, is there any additional, are there additional tools I might need? For example, if I'm Zooming in the classroom on our campus, not teaching, I don't teach at the law school, quick disclaimer there. But when I am in the classroom testing with our professors, I've encouraged them to keep their laptop separate as an attendee on the side so that they can see what the online students are seeing while, doing whatever it is they're doing on the classroom computer in person. And I will tell you, there is a strong sense of guilt, of feeling of not being able, like, oh, I didn't engage those guys. Oh no, now I'm not engaging these guys. It is what it is. And as long as we are all honest with our students and with ourselves at the beginning, maybe it's working out with the students. Like, if you see a hand raised behind me, like, raise your own hand, like, help each other out. Like, we're going through this as a community, right? So I think it will take testing, it will take practicing, and again, I keep saying this, right? But figuring out what works for you and what you're comfortable with, and asking for assistance when it's just not working out the way you hope it will.
Yeah, I just want to, I agree with everything Corinne said, but I just want to emphasize the practicing piece, the technology, particularly in terms of this high flex model that a lot of schools, including my new school, will be using. It's going to require a lot of practice. It's not something that I think any of us will be able to just go into the classroom and do. But my other suggestion, if you do have a cohort that is sort of beaming into the class and whether they're alternating or not, think about some other structures for those students who are outside of class. And so think about all of the arrows in your new online teaching quiver, whether it's discussion boards, whether it's Zoom one-on-one office hours, whether it's emails, whether you're finding some way to engage with those students sort of separate and apart from the face-to-face classroom experience that the other students will be getting, I think will be very, very important. And in fact, the ABA, in the variance application that's due next week, that's along the lines. One of the questions they're asking is, how are you going to maintain that kind of connection and feedback and communication? And I really encourage everyone to think about tools other than email. Email is an easy default, but first of all, it's not that much fun. You're responding to, let's say, 20 student questions, but it's not necessarily the most efficient. I think there are other ways, whether it's a small Zoom office hours, whether it's drop-in office hours on Zoom, whether it's a discussion board, whether it's a video presentation, whatever it is. I think there are other more efficient ways of keeping in contact with those students in a HyFlex model.
That's great. All right, it's 4:18. I would add one last thing based on what I just heard from both of you, is that you're going to make mistakes. There are going to be difficulties. Be forgiving of yourself as you go forward. I think your students hopefully will understand that you're making the effort, and if it's sincere, then that message will come across. So thanks, both of you. That was fantastic. I appreciate it. We're now down to 2 last sessions on Thursday and then next Tuesday. So see you all next Thursday.